So today I want to talk about Kenosha, double standards, and Chrystul Kizer. Now, I've been spending a good deal of time this past week thinking about the circumstances around the Kenosha shooting and around Kyle Rittenhouse's trial. And as I've been thinking about all of this, there's one thought that keeps popping up more than any others. And that is, how would all of this have gone differently in the case where Kyle Rittenhouse were black? And I think about this in particular, given the amount of black youths, the amount of black children that are tried as adults in the United States. I think about how often it is that black children are treated as adults by the police that they encounter, by the media that portrays them, and by the judges and juries who sentence them. And how many children's lives are ruined through the criminal justice system because of the fact that these children are treated as adults, that they are presented with a very racialized bias of adultification. And so I was wondering, since Kyle Rittenhouse was 17, how all of this would manifest for a black 17-year-old Kyle Rittenhouse. And when I started thinking about this, I started thinking about how absurd that proposition really is, because of the circumstances that went into Kyle Rittenhouse's life. I can't imagine what a black Kyle Rittenhouse would look like. And I think about this in particular around the experiences around the time of the shooting, not just in that moment, but around his whole life, truly, but in those moments in particular. And that leads into his court case and his trial and all of the media around it. Because I can't imagine in all of this what it would look like for a young black Rittenhouse to have so much faith and trust in the system at that age. I don't imagine that his actions that night in Kenosha would even be remotely what he did. And so it's really absurd to even process what a black Kyle Rittenhouse would look like in the United States. And I start with looking at the idea that he traveled across two state lines to pick up an AR-15 from his friend's house, only to travel to a spot that had a curfew in the middle of a protest in order to guard a business, where the police responded to him and the other people around him by saying, "We appreciate you guys." And I can't even fathom this. And I can't fathom this because historically, that's not how this goes. I think back to the Black Panthers, and when organizations like the Panthers would go outside with guns and protect their neighborhoods from the police, from white supremacist organizations. They would literally stand there and guard their communities and their neighborhoods in order to protect people. And how that went for them. How it went for them via the police's response, how it went for them via the CIA and COINTELPRO's response, and how eventually those guns were no longer allowed in communities because of organizations like the Panthers. And I think about how absurd it would be that someone in Rittenhouse's place would, one, feel safe enough to do what he did in that instance, but also feel secure enough that the police coming up to him in that moment weren't there to threaten him, and that the police, in fact, weren't there to threaten him, but to say that we appreciate you. And then when we move past the shootings, because I know the circumstances around the shootings end up being a whole thing into themselves, but can you imagine after shooting 3 people with an AR-15, a young black Rittenhouse walking up to police and having so much faith in the police and so much trust in the system that he's willing to walk up to them and say, "I just shot someone." And then on top of that, for this young man or this young child walking up to this police officer, being ignored by the police, as Rittenhouse was, because he was considered to be not the active shooter on the ground. Can you imagine the police not, at the very least, brutally arresting him, if not flat out killing him on the spot? Because I can't. And I can't imagine that he would in any way, shape, or form be in this space where the police left him there in all of that. I also can't imagine that an organization, a right-wing organization in particular like Fox News, would ever come to his aid. In fact, they'd be criticizing him. They'd be harping on him. all of these same white supremacist organizations, all of these same groups that have protected him, all of these industries that have come out in support of Rittenhouse would have been the first people critiquing him and criticizing him. They would have been calling him names. This media circus would have called him names and things that I honestly don't even want to bring up. And he certainly wouldn't have been depicted as a young man who had cleaned graffiti the day before and had a medic bag and was just there to help people. He would not have gotten all of this positive media attention. None of it would have worked out in his favor. And I bring this up mostly because when I think about all of these circumstances, I imagine, again, all of these Black youth that have experienced quite the opposite. And as I was exploring some of the details around some of the stories, one in particular stood out to me, and that was that of Chrystul Kizer, a 17-year-old girl who shot her abuser to defend herself back in 2018. And she and her circumstances stood out to me because self-defense is something that she's still fighting to have recognized to this day, even though this incident happened in 2018. And on top of it, she's being tried in Kenosha. And so I started seeing a double standard here. And, it's unfortunate that this double standard keeps happening. But I do want to talk about the circumstances of what happened and emphasize Chrystul Kizer's story, because if Rittenhouse can get off as having a self-defense circumstance, there's no reason that Chrystul Kizer should not. So we have here that according to a 2019 Post investigation, at the time of the shooting, Kizer had been sexually abused by Volar for nearly 2 years, the man in question. She first met him when she was 16 years old, after placing an ad on the defunct Backpage.com in the hopes of earning money for snacks and school supplies. I've heard reports that she was actively in need of food and notebooks, and was seeking help to get that. And since her family had recently moved to Milwaukee to flee an abusive partner of her mother's, Kizer, an artist and violinist, lived in a homeless shelter for months before finding an apartment. And after responding to Kizer's ad, Voller, the man in question, bought her dinner, bought her gifts, gave her cash, and most importantly, acted as a quote-unquote friend when Kizer really needed one. And what was the payment for all of this? It was specific sexual acts that he asked of her and which he filmed regularly. And as it says here, she was quoted as saying, "He was a grown-up and I wasn't, so I listened." And so this is the person that on June 5th of 2018, that she kills, Randall Voller, who was 34 at the time. And when she did this, she was forced to receive $400,000 in bond before she could be removed from prison. So she was literally on, it was required that she pay $400,000 to be removed from prison. That is what they agreed to, for her acting in self-defense as a victim of sex trafficking. And as we go through more and more of the case, we find out that that this guy, Randall Voller, was actually doing this to other people. He had groomed several other individuals, and he was, in fact, doing this while under investigation from the police. The police were aware of this, and he had not been tried or convicted of anything, but was in fact being investigated. And in all of this, she is a survivor. And instead of him being treated as the perpetrator of violence and her automatically being defined as doing self-defense, she is facing charges of arson and premeditated homicide, which could carry a life sentence in prison, even though she was 17 at the time of doing it. Now, a lot of people have rallied around her cause, especially with the recent Rittenhouse case, to say that the charges should be dropped. And I quite honestly feel that that's the least that she deserves. This is someone who is being charged with premeditated homicide or murder, specifically because court documents show that on June 8th, in which she had made a post on Facebook that displayed a pistol and that she was not afraid to kill again. Now, I want to emphasize the fact that Kyle Rittenhouse had kind of the same thing in his circumstance, that there was a 29-second clip that was included in the court case where he was standing in front of a CVS store and he saw a bunch of people who were running out. Rittenhouse assumed that they were shoplifters, and he said on camera, "Bruh, I wish I had my fucking AR. I'd start shooting rounds at them." This is the person who was said to be innocent in all of this. Meanwhile, he clearly had a desire to shoot his gun to prove himself, and this video was only from 15 days earlier. So he threatened to kill someone on this baseless assumption, even though he didn't have his weapon there, but he is presumed innocent. While we have Crystal Kizer here, who's not perceived to be innocent in any way, shape, or form, for making a Facebook post about the fact that she's not afraid to kill someone. Now, Mr. Gravely, the person involved that's, I think, part of the prosecution, said permitting vigilante justice, which is the narrative for some seeking dismissal, is a highly subjective, slippery slope. And I want to emphasize again, it wasn't a slippery slope when it came to Rittenhouse. It was considered to be just absolutely normal that he would be out there with a gun trying to protect property. That was considered to be safe and secure. Had he done so standing in front of the business, I don't know, would he have been treated the same? And certainly when you had two people chasing him down trying to disarm someone who had actively shot someone else, you could see why maybe they were trying to do what they were trying to do to disarm him, to disarm the situation further. And again, he's not seen as it being a vigilante, but she is. And it's just absurd in all of this, how these circumstances get twisted and changed when it comes to a young black girl versus a young white boy in all of this. And so she added that in all of this, that she didn't intentionally try to do this. This wasn't intentional. According to her, she was pinned on the floor by Mr. Vuller. And this was right before she started shooting him. So these are the circumstances that we have in this case. And the unfortunate reality is that there's no equality and justice happening in all of this. Crystal Kizer is being penalized for defending herself. And while I don't know the full circumstances truly of either case, I wasn't there. And of course, when it comes to the court cases, the jury and the judges always will have a little bit more information, or usually will have a little bit more information than anything that appears in the media. But from what we do know, there is a likelihood that she shot somebody who was physically harming her and abusing her. But because she went there of her own volition after making that tweet, or that Facebook post, kind of similar to what Rittenhouse did, she is being put in a situation where she's being treated as a criminal and faces life sentence in prison, where Rittenhouse was seen as defending himself. And I know there's going to be people who hear about this and are constantly trying to find the small differences in the cases and try to justify the decisions and uphold the law. The problem is that this is far from the only case where this kind of discrepancy is set up. The racial bias in our court systems are evident. They've been racially biased for a long time, and they continue to be so. And there's just so many overwhelming cases that if people were just honest with themselves and were willing to look at themselves and the system that we're in, they would recognize that self-defense usually only applies in one direction in the United States. And that's been the case for a long time. And it's just exhausting having to make this case over and over and over again, no matter how much evidence piles up, no matter how many anecdotes we go to, no matter how many statistics we show, no matter how much we talk about this. The fact is that it is exhausting having to keep mentioning this and show these double standards and have them keep being ignored by these little what if or but statements. There's no reason in any of this, that Crystal Kizer should not be treated as having defended herself from someone who actively abused her, not just once, but on a regular basis, who was actively abusing other people on a regular basis. And when she defends herself, she is not treated as having defended herself. And that is the reality of the court system that we're in. And no matter how exhausting this is, we need to keep defending those like Crystal Kizer and shouting her name out there. So with that said, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and the bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter, check out my Discord, and support me on Patreon. All of those links are in the description down below. With that said, my name is Anarchist Tara. Thank you for watching.